and even a moment of dialogue that makes you say to yourself very softly, HMM ... The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are.
Today, it's an absolute privilege and a deep, deep honor to welcome Rob Kapilow all the way from New York City. Rob is a composer, a conductor, commentator. He is also an amazing musician who has really changed the world that I know. I have been personally influenced by him tremendously when we did some work together in Istanbul a few years ago, and I have never forgotten that, and it has actually made a deep impact in my life. So with that, I'd like to welcome Rob Kapilow. Rob, it's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I feel the same way about your impact on me.
You're very kind. The power of listening, and listening, helping empathy, listening through not just our ears, but everything around us. Those are some of the messages that I got from you in my first sort of interactions with you. What are your sort of early impressions or early sort of thoughts and comments in terms of how people listen?
You know, it's really interesting. One of the projects I've worked on for several years is there's a wonderful program at Stanford University called the Knight Hennessy Scholars Program for people who are working on a graduate degree in almost any area of life. But the idea is to really create a next generation of world leaders. So they're really looking for interdisciplinary people, and they go all over the world to find these people who they really feel have the kind of breadth of experience and breadth of interest that could really become the next generation of world leaders. And I was doing a talk with them a couple of years ago called Fail, Fail Again, Fail Better. Which was what Beckett put beside his typewriter each day. And, you know, it's really interesting when you get to people like that, they have actually very little experience with failure. And I thought it would be an interesting thing they get to that program by not failing, but yet then the slightest thing can derail their experiences. So I was doing a program there, and there was this one girl who was there just as a guest, and she became really interested in what was going on, and she contacted me later. One of the things that's really interesting is everywhere I go, I give every single person I've ever spoken to, which is now thousands of people, my home email. And I say, if anyone has a thought based on what I've said, a project, an idea, contact me. And it's really interesting how few people listen to that possibility and really grab it. This woman did, and I've been sort of talking with her over the last 3 years, and I just had a conversation with her yesterday that was all about listening. Now, she was a 13-year-old alcoholic and drug addict. When she was a teenager, she got addicted to drugs and alcohol at the age of 13. To make a long story short, she gradually pulled herself out of that world. She's now getting a PhD at Stanford, and she's one of the most important people in drug education in the entire state of California. She's on an advisory council. And I talked to her about what she felt was really missing. What got her engaged in that behavior? What does she really feel these kids who are 13, 14, and 15 and are involved with drugs are? And she says, you know, there's a tremendous focus on punishment and suspension in the schools. In other words, you have a drug problem, you're immediately suspended. And she said, what's really missing is listening. No one actually hears the kids. And I asked her what changed it for her. And she said there was one teacher who she felt actually heard her, who actually listened to her, wasn't trying to judge her, wasn't trying to suspend her, but just actually heard her. And she said when she felt herself reflected in this mentor's listening, she felt heard and of value for the first time. Now, I went out to Stanford and I was doing a presentation for the medical school on listening for doctors and surgeons and everyone in the medical school. And after the presentation, which was on Beethoven and the art of listening, the head of the psychiatry department came up to me afterwards. And she said, I really, really enjoyed your program. I particularly enjoyed your emphasis on listening. She said, you know, most people think that when they go to therapy, the real value is the advice and the suggestions that they get from the therapist. But she says that's not what it's really about. For most people, they never have a space where they are truly listened to in a non-judgmental way. And she said a sentence that to me has stuck with me forever. She says, listening is an inherently healing act. Listening is an inherently healing act. Being heard. For most people, perhaps that experience at a therapist's office might be the only time they are truly heard And true listening is an inherently healing act. So I think that's been my experience. And that's really at the heart of this whole addiction program that she's actually trying to get to, is to create mentors in the schools for each of these individuals so that they can feel that they're somewhere where they are truly heard, because simply being heard is an inherently healing act.
Well, there you go. You started with a pearl of wisdom right from the word go. So thank you for that. Let me just share my 5 F's of failure. Fail fast, fail frequently, failure is not fatal,
Right.
and always fail forward. And the 6th bonus failure or F word is failure is a good F word. So those are my 6 F's of failure. And it's interesting you mentioned failure, because when I first failed in my life at my accountancy exam, it was the first failure that I ever had in my life, and I was spectacularly successful prior to that, but I spectacularly failed and fell off the edge and I actually had this conversation with my parents that you gave me love, you gave me affection, you gave me protection, you gave me everything. You never gave me that strength and the power to be able to engage with failure. And this is a social and cultural issue here. So it's quite interesting that you mentioned that. So do you feel that failure is something that our youth are struggling with, or fear of failure?
Yeah, it's really interesting. What I discovered as I was preparing for that program was that almost all the major sort of quote unquote, what we call elite institutions, Harvard, Princeton, et cetera, like that, they've discovered that their students are, and they invented this term, failure deprived. In other words, they got into these schools because they were successful. They were in every club. They did fantastically on their grades, their SATs, but that they were failure deprived. And what they found was the slightest obstacle caused complete chaos for them. They had no resilience. And so almost all the major universities started to create these resilience projects. I mean, they gave them different names, the Princeton Failure Project or the Resilience Project, but that the students were incapable of handling even the smallest amount of failure. And it just completely derailed them. And I thought that was really interesting, that they were failure deprived. And what I tried to do with these kids is I asked them, to list, what were their greatest failures. And I put them in a group and I asked them to list what were their greatest failures in one column, but then in the other column to list what they got or what wisdom they gained from those failures, which was interesting. And then I asked people to just share the wisdom with their group without sharing the failures. But then the really interesting part was I gave them a choice. They could either keep both their wisdoms and their failures, or they could keep just the wisdom or just the failures, and they had to decide what they wanted to keep and take with them as they went into the future, and then explain which choice they made. And so it was really interesting. But I do feel that there is a tremendous fear of failure, and the more success you have, the greater the fear of failure. If you watch that Hulu series on The Dropout, on the Theranos, I mean, the fear of failure literally created years and years and billions of dollars of hoax just because of the inability to admit that the process simply didn't work. So I do feel there's an enormous fear of failure, and also that there's so much identity wrapped up in it. But you talked about your failure. One of my biggest failures was literally on the stage of Carnegie Hall and in the New York Times. And it turned out to be the key to the entire rest of my career. This was quite early on. Early music performance practice sort of entered the world of music about 20 or 30 years ago. Fundamentally, the idea that if we really wanted to understand old music, we should play on old instruments. We should play on harpsichords. We should play on therebos, these old instruments that if we really wanted to understand the music of Bach, we should play on the instruments Bach used. And so period instrument orchestras were all the rage. And this was about 25 years ago. And New York didn't really have one of these period instrument orchestras. It started the phenomenon more in Europe. We were trying to catch up. Anyway, they formed a very high profile period instrument orchestra in New York. Trevor Pinnock was the conductor. A lot of publicity behind this, a lot of money behind this. And they were going to do their debut concert in Carnegie Hall with the New York Times present. And they asked me to do just a little short 3-minute introduction explaining what this period instrument stuff was all about, why this orchestra was special. And this was very early in my career. I was in my 20s. And I decided, okay, I'm going to really do this. I know they said 2 or 3 minutes, but I'm going to really go into it. I'm going to sit at the keyboard. I'm going to do this explanation. So I started talking about this at this big debut concert, 3,000 people, Carnegie Hall, New York Times. And I started going and I kept going. And the guy who was the orchestra manager was going, cut, stop. And I just kept going because I was sure this was going to be really valuable information. And I went on for about 10 minutes. And finally, I got off the stage. We were slaughtered in the New York Times. Who is this guy talking for 10 minutes? We came to hear this period instrument. The orchestra manager was furious. You will never work in this town again. It was a complete disaster. But I learned a really important lesson about listening, because listening is really on a multi-level here. What I realized was I didn't listen to the situation. I didn't listen to who I was as part of this event. And what I realized was if you want to talk about music, you have to create an event where people know that's what you're going to be doing. In other words, this was a kind of bait and switch. They thought they were coming to a concert. Here's this guy talking. And the whole idea for What Makes It Great, which became my series that was on National Public Radio, concert series, where I take apart a piece of music and there's all this talk and exploration. The whole idea grew out of that failure, realizing if you wanted to do that, you had to say up front, this is what we're going to do, so people could make the choice that this is the kind of event they wanted to come to, and their listening would have been prepared for it. So in a way, that was one of my greatest failures, but it was the key to almost everything I've done after that, realizing that you have to listen to who you are in the context of the situation you're in. And so it was a great lesson for me.
Thank you for that. It's a perfect segue into requesting you to basically give us a 1-2 minute rendition of your story, your history, and perhaps how you evolved into the great composer, commentator that you are today.
Well, I think for me, really, it was kind of, when you throw a pebble into a lake, the ripples get wider and wider and wider. And that was really the story for me. When I began, it was kind of a very narrow approach. I was a classical musician. I went to Yale and I had this interesting moment, and I think this is valuable for other people. A friend of mine who is a psychiatrist said, most people know what they know. Some people know what they don't know. But what's really interesting is what you don't know, you don't know. And, I was an undergraduate at Yale studying music and finished all the required courses. I thought I knew what I needed to know. But I had this vague sense, I had finished all the courses, done really well. And I thought, this is it. This is what Bach and Beethoven knew. I didn't know what I didn't know about music, but I just somehow sensed that there was something more. And, one of the things that I think is really valuable, Anne Lamott wrote this wonderful book called Bird by Bird. And in this book, she talks about what you do when you're stuck in a project. She's talking about writing, but it can be any of us who have been stuck in any kind of business proposal, just you're getting nowhere. And she says, you're there and every page is worse than the page. And she says, eventually you find yourself back on page 4. And there's one paragraph that has all sorts of life in it, scents, smells, sights and sounds, and even a moment of dialogue that makes you say to yourself very softly, HMM ... And listening for this to me is the single most important thing you can do in your life, only superseded by when you hear it, act on it. So something in me went, this couldn't be all I needed to learn. And I needed to do something else to find out. So anyway, to make a long story short, there's a famous woman in Paris named Nadia Boulanger, who was the most famous composition teacher in the 20th century. She taught Gershwin and Bernstein and Stravinsky, Copland, all these famous, Philip Glass, Astor Piazzolla. And so I dropped out of college because something said, and I went to France to study. And what I really did was study listening. I learned how to listen. I learned all that I was missing in all this music. And then I realized that my future work would be to help other people. People often come up with a mission statement. And for me, it first started as transforming how people listen to music. Now, that was the first stage. So I came back to the United States, finished, got a great job teaching at Yale, 26, youngest professor, conducting the orchestra. Then I went to Broadway. I got an opportunity to conduct on Broadway, and that changed everything. Because what I realized was in the classical music world, and this is true in business as well, we often focus on our side of the footlights. In other words, we think about what kind of music do we want to play? How do we want to play it? But when I went to Broadway, I realized that the focus was completely the opposite. Every moment in a Broadway show is about what will the audience's experience be? What will it be like for them? Not what do we want to do on our side of the stage. And so as I went back and forth, because for 3 foolish months, I tried to be a Yale professor and do a Broadway show as conductor, I would go back and forth between these two worlds. One world where people politely applauded and basically, being honest, didn't get the music.
Yeah.
And then this other world of Broadway where everybody got it, was willing to pay enormous ticket prices, but they got the language of the music. And I realized going back and forth that it was too depressing to continue. And I realized I didn't want to do this anymore if people weren't going to get it. And then I came across this brilliant quote from the poet Walt Whitman. And he said, "To have great poets, there must be great audiences." Or in my version, to have great music, there must be great listeners. And I realized I had to shift the entire perspective of my career from this side of the footlights to the other side of the footlights. And so I became interested in what was happening on the other side. Again, how were people listening to me? You know, I was at the same time, I mean, bizarre story for another day, I became the guest artist or artist in residence for the Hallmark greeting card creative writing staff. And I spent a wonderful weekend there with these people. And there was a wonderful presentation about communication. And he said something really interesting. He said, communication doesn't happen here. It happens out there. And said, take responsibility for how people listen to you. And that was really powerful. Take responsibility for how people listen. Now, we have all sorts of excuses we give for why people, quote unquote, don't like classical music. Lack of education, blah, 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 blah. But no one was taking responsibility for how people heard that. And so my entire career shifted towards helping people actually get this music. That's what my books, my CDs, television, PBS, NPR, all of it grew out of shifting my perspective from what we wanted to do here to what was happening out there, to helping people actually listen. And then it continued to widen because at first it was just classical music. But then Lincoln Center said, well, we're starting an American songbook series. Could you do the same kind of thing you're doing with a Schubert song with Irving Berlin or George Gershwin? So it widened there. Then it widened to jazz. Then they said, well, could you do something with world music? So I spent 2 years learning Javanese gamelan music to play that. And it just kept getting wider and wider. And the same thing with composition. At first, you're writing Symphony No. 1. Or whatever that is. But I became interested in what people were thinking. And I started to write what I call city pieces, where I would go into a city and just find what was on people's mind. What were they interested in? And I would write a piece with the city. I would play little excerpts on the radio. I would ask them to talk. Right now, I'm writing a piece called We Came to America, which is based on intergenerational immigrant interviews that I've been doing for the last 3 years, just based on what are people's experiences of coming to America. What did they leave behind? What did they bring with them? And putting kids, parents, and grandparents in a room for these interviews has been amazing. And the whole project is growing out of that. So I started to write music that was actually connected in a different way to people as well. So this idea, I guess I could sum up in 3 words, you know, from E.M. Forster: connect, only connect. In other words, there's so much Emperor's New Clothes pretending that this music is getting across, pretending that we're connecting. And it goes back to that whole issue of truth that you so often talk about. Is it real? Are we connecting? So I'm trying to write music. I'm trying to talk to people, but everything is about, is this real? Is this authentic? Are we actually making a connection? You know, I still remember the very first NPR show I ever did was on the Mother Goose Suite, and it was on 2 seconds of music. The piece opens with these 2 spare lines. Very spare, just a melody and a very simple accompaniment. Just 2 parts, sort of black and white. We don't know what anyone is really feeling. But then later, that same melody comes back, not like this, but with this rich chord. And the difference between and this is a completely different world. But when people get that, you feel like we are now connected. But when you normally do it in a hall, I'm here, I'm here. And that ability to connect, only connect, I think for me is really the ongoing principle. Whatever I'm doing now, is there a connection? And that's what I try to filter everything I do through.
You know, I learned how to listen to classical music through you. Until then, I actually didn't. And we'll certainly get back to that, Rob. The series that we are developing is called Voices of the Future, a close brother or sister to listening, and how we're projecting our voice, how we're amplifying our message, how we are engaging. Perhaps I should rename the series, you know, Listening for the Future, as opposed to Voices of the Future. But certainly, I think there's this interplay, and when we are projecting our voice and our messaging, what are the kinds of things that we need to be looking towards and looking at when actually doing that? I think a lot of us tend to forget.
That's a great question. I think the first thing I think is really important is that, and this is about listening, is actually listening to yourself to make sure that the voice you're projecting is actually authentically yours. You know, one of my favorite quotes from Joseph Campbell, the brilliant writer on mythology, is he says, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." Now, I mean, being who you are, not who other people think you should be, not who your colleagues think you should be, your parents, or even, and this one is really deep, not even necessarily who you think you should be, but who you actually are, is actually, in my experience, the key to actually projecting that voice out. So often people are projecting a voice that isn't theirs. I'm sure you've had the experience, whether it's in business, it could be at a hotel desk, it could be, you know, your gas station repairman, of somebody who is truly actually what they are, that this is what they are on the planet. They are meant to be. I mean, we have someone who repairs our cars. I mean, every time I bring my car in, I get an entire lecture on the history of automotive mechanics, but it's clear that he was born to actually be this particular person. I was in a hotel last week. This woman at the desk clerk, she was born to help I mean, she gave me more help as a desk clerk than I've gotten from anyone in my life. I mean, you see people who are authentically themselves, and that communicates. Like, one of my favorite people on Broadway is Bernadette Peters. She starred in so many of these Sondheim musicals, and you can see her, you know, if you look up on YouTube, and she's not by any means the best singer. There are tremendous voices out there that are far superior to her voice. But when she sits there and sings, you know, "You would have liked him, Mama, you would," you know, about children and art, you just feel like this person is so connected, and her voice rings out. It's soft. It's not even particularly beautiful, but she's so connected and so who she is that it reaches across the footlights. And so I think people often spend a lot of time thinking, how can I project my voice outward, as opposed to actually looking inward to making sure that it's really you? Because when it's really you, it projects outward. And, you know, that for me was my discovery. You know, early on when I was conducting, I would actually try to go and watch all the famous conductors and try to do it like them. Like, I would watch Leonard Bernstein and I would move my arms. I would copy in a mirror Seiji Ozawa. I would go to their rehearsals and hear how they talk to the orchestra and try to talk to the orchestra until I finally realized I just need to move like I move and talk like how I talk. And so now I talk to an orchestra exactly like this. And if you're authentic, that is by far the thing that comes across most. It's the key to every great performer in music. It's the key to every great leader. It's when you are who you are. That to me is the key. So it's not looking out there for what will project. It's looking in here for what is truly authentically you.
And that is so amazing because, you know, I sometimes, every now and then I'm asked to do sort of presentation communication skills programs for boards and C-level people. Generally, they are pathetic. They are not very good at projecting and communicating. So,
Right.
you know, and I've had people come to me, we want to speak like you. And
Yeah.
I said, okay, thank you very much for the compliment. So he said, what's your secret? And it took me a little while in the beginning, but now it comes very, very naturally to me. And I said, you need to be authentic. You need to be human. And I would go more than that. I keep saying you need to speak with your heart. You need to live within yourself. And if you're there, be vulnerable if you have to. I said, I talk about my failure. I talk about my clumsiness. I talk about
Absolutely.
all sorts of things like that. I don't talk about my perfection, because that's not how we would project ourselves. And a lot of people in business find it extremely difficult to be vulnerable.
Right.
And and authenticity and vulnerability are close friends, because that's when you really
Absolutely.
open up yourself from within, and you go out there and you speak to people like that. So so it really resonates with me. But taking that and peeling the onion a wee bit more, I talk a lot about trust and
Mhm.
ethics and truth in the context of business. And perhaps we should take a little journey towards business also. I feel that trust has always been at a premium. But today
Yeah.
we can't travel because without trust, we cannot communicate without trust. And it's just become a fundamental issue within us. From your experiences, trust and truth, trust and ethics, ethics and technology, and so on, can you find a way to relate that into how the great masters actually built their lives, and they built that trust in terms of their listeners and their followers? Where's the essence of that trust from?
Well, first, I want to say that you have certainly hit upon a major point in this world. I mean, one of the things that's so hard is we are literally filled every day with complete lack of trust. You open your computer, and what do you get is spam, phishing. I mean, literally every time you open your email, you have at least 5 things that are completely untrue, and you spend an enormous amount of your day saying, is this real? Is this really from the government? Is this really from Medicare? Is this really from Social Security? I mean, so I think we're often not aware of how we've built up a doubt, a skepticism, around just how we interact with the world, because there is so much lack of trust everywhere. And I feel like it's such a rare commodity to find a person or an institution that you feel like you can actually trust them. And one of the things that's so important, if you're a conductor or a performer or really a collaborator of anyone, is to have the feeling of trust between the actual members. How you listen to someone as a conductor, how you correct someone. I mean, it's no different than a project leader or a CEO actually correct. What kind of an atmosphere you create about the possibility of being vulnerable, about having failure. I mean, that's what creates the entire mood. I go to many, many different orchestras, and it's so rare to feel like there is room for this kind of trust between. One of the things that's really interesting is I'm an artist partner for the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. Now, the normal dynamic in orchestras is very much like a very vertical kind of company, which is that the maestro, the conductor, basically has all the knowledge. And the job of the employees, the players, is simply to execute the vision of the CEO. And there's a kind of hierarchy there where I'm the one who knows, I'm the one who makes the decision. They call you maestro, their version of CEO, and their job is simply to implement my vision. But the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra works without conductor. And when you go to a rehearsal there, it's completely opposite. Anyone in that orchestra is allowed to make a comment. Anyone can have an opinion, and it is much slower, much less efficient than that top-down management style. But the connection in that orchestra is electrifying. There is a feeling of trust that anyone can say, and sometimes people say stupid things, and sometimes people shout them down, but there is truly a feeling that everybody in that group has the right to say something, and it's a safe place to say it, whether it's good or it's bad. And it produces a completely different kind of performance in which everybody is connect. Again, it all comes back, connect, only connect. They're no longer a bunch of individuals working for some CEO, but everyone is engaged, everyone has a participatory role, and there's a completely different feeling in that. And it's all about trust and creating an atmosphere where everybody has the right to participate.
I learned about the beautiful metaphor of an orchestra, and I saw you in Istanbul. You, as the conductor of the orchestra, was actually coordinating and harmonizing and creating that sort of synchronization for everybody, which is very much a metaphor for business.
Sure.
Do you feel that you use that our CEOs and our leaders today actually understand that metaphor as you present it. The fact that every single segment is different and they need to align, they need to put all and harmonize and synchronize, and do they listen properly for that? And what are the sort of things that we need to do to make that work for us?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And different ones are different, just like different conductors. In other words, there are CEOs who conduct like this. Micromanaging, literally, I have all the, you do this, you do this. Then there are the ones who completely abdicate. But there's a kind of way that when you do it, one of the things I really learned early on was that you think conducting is about leading. But once again, it's so often about listening. One of the most powerful things you can do as you're conducting is you're just listening. I'm just hearing what it is. Okay, little here, little there. But fundamentally, I'm starting that my first impulse is not to lead, but to listen, to hear what's out there. And your job is to make what's out there the best possible. And that can only happen if you're not busy leading, but if you're busy listening. And there's this wonderful moment by moment thing happening in the best leaders, whether you're a CEO or a conductor, where I'm hearing it, I'm working with it, they're listening, we're all listening together. There's nothing more riveting than 100 people actually listening. People often think, I've had the advantage of conducting some of the world's most famous orchestras, Cleveland Orchestra, Philadelphia Orchestra, some of the world's elementary school orchestras, high school, literally the entire range. Most people think that the difference between the great orchestras, great companies, and the worst ones is that they're simply better players at the great orchestras. It's not true. It's not that they're better players. It's that they're better listeners. When you go to the Cleveland Orchestra, the last stand double bass on the opposite side of the stage is hearing everything that's happening across the stage in the last stand of the violins. Everyone is so intensely listening to each other. That's why these orchestras sound so great, no matter who's conducting. Because fundamentally, the connection is happening amongst them, hearing each other, building on each other, and the person at the top is just shaping something that's already going on. That's the kind of company you want, but it's very rare to have a kind of leader who is aware. First of all, it comes from really valuing the players you hire, really valuing who you've actually got out there and believing that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There's a wonderful book. Well, it's not such a great book, but it's a great title. It's called The Wisdom of Crowds. And the idea is that the group knows more than any individual or more than any person leading it. I'm not a flute player. I know a lot about the orchestra, but that excellent flute player knows something about flute that I don't. And he's sitting next to a clarinetist who's the world's greatest. And really, in the great orchestras, it's the listening that's powerful, not the playing. And that, to me, is the metaphor that I think people should bring. But it takes, first of all, great confidence and willingness to get rid of your ego needs, feeling that I have to be the one going like this. If it comes together beautifully, unless it was clear that it was because of me, then it's not a success. So you have to be accepting of the result without you being the one who produced that result.
Indeed. And the word that comes to me, or the emotion that comes to me, is empathy. And that listening and connecting together is empathizing, and being able to wait for the other person and be there at the right time. And I think that level of empathy is so important in our modern world of technology. And we'll get into empathy in a second, Rob, but the other element is ethics. When I look at artificial intelligence, when I look at robotics and so on, I feel a world without ethics and empathy, in a world of AI, in a world of robotics, and self-driving cars, or workers that are going out there. I find it'll be a very dystopian environment if you don't have an ethics in place. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, it's really interesting. I did a talk for the Young Presidents Organization a long time ago, which is an executive leadership organization. And they're doing a big sort of international session in Kyoto, Japan. And I went there to do a speech on listening. And the opening greeting came from the princess of Japan. And she's this wonderful woman who also is at the United Nations, and she works on international diplomacy. And, so she's doing big country to country meetings. And she talked to us and she said, everyone thinks that because I'm at the UN and working with countries on international diplomacy, that everything is happening on this big global level. She says, international diplomacy begins with the person sitting next to you. Yeah. And I think that's the same thing, trust and ethics begins with each conversation. And, it's interesting, next week I'm doing a residency at the University of Miami at the music school there. And the first class I'm doing they asked me to do a class on professionalism. What counts as professionalism? What do we need to do as future musicians? And ethics is so at the heart of it. One of the first things is do what you said you were going to do. Have the integrity to show up. One of the interesting decisions I made really early in my career, to me, is what ethics are really all about. Early on, I was an accompanist, pianist for, at the time, I won't mention the name, of a pretty famous singer. And so I was sort of her music director. And we would go around the country performing with all these major orchestras and in recitals. And I would be the piano accompanist, and she would be the star for all these things. And we had a date a year in advance at a major presenter in America. I won't say which one it was, but it was one of the 2 or 3 biggest presenters. And at the same time, Leonard Bernstein had just died. And I had gotten an offer, and I was in my late 20s, and I'd gotten an offer from a German orchestra who wanted a young composer in the mold of Bernstein who would come and guest conduct, and would I write something in memory of Leonard Bernstein. So, though I didn't speak German at the time, I said I would learn German, and I wrote an In Memoriam Leonard Bernstein symphony for this orchestra in Germany. And I went to do the program, and it was a big, big success. And there was an orchestra manager there, and he offered me a big orchestra tour of my piece and guest conducting throughout Germany. But it conflicted with that date I had committed to as an accompanist at this presenter in New York, a presenter in Boston. And everyone was saying, just don't do that date. You're just an accompanist. This is a big opportunity. You have 5 concerts throughout Germany. You're the composer. You're the conductor. Just get rid of the other event. My manager, everyone was telling me, but I said, no, I committed to that date. I'm sorry. I said I would be there. I'm going to be there. No one could believe it. I turned down the tour. I went and did that. Then the presenter was so impressed that I now have been there for the last 20 years as a center of that series. And one of the biggest series I do in America has grown out of that, simply because of the ethical stance I took to do their date and not cancel. So do what you say you're going to do. And it starts on that smallest level. And that's who you want to be. I mean, I tell these people, respond to every email. Every conversation you have with the 3rd assistant to the vice president is as important as the presentation in Kyoto, Japan. Every person matters. Treat every interaction as if they are the most important person in the world. When I see a hotel, you talk about the lack of empathy. I mean, you cannot replace that one woman who was the hotel desk clerk when late at night there was no one giving me any food, and she went into the pantry and found food. You cannot replace that human interaction. For me, that is that entire hotel chain now. There's some CEO in a boardroom thinking that the fancy decisions their AI is making about what the company should do. But my experience, like that princess in Japan, is that one desk clerk, and she's the one who, for me, is that hotel chain. So it all begins with the person sitting next to you, and have the integrity to do what you said you're going to do with every person and every interaction, from the 3rd assistant to the vice president to the Princess of Japan.
That's amazing advice, Rob. But it's leading me into a very interesting new phase that we are now encountering literally over the last month, 6 weeks. And that's the new discovery of Chat GPT, which is this AI that you're talking to, and it really gives you all of the answers. And Google gave us all of the answers. Google became our parent. Google became our teacher. And now we're going to the next level, where it'll write an essay, it will write a symphony, it will do all sorts of things. What are your thoughts on that? And initially, I mean, your initial reaction to this kind of, omniscient being that knows everything and is all powerful? And how's that going to affect us and the way we live?
It's interesting. This actually issue came up several years ago in music, where they created a kind of a software program that could take in all the data, say, of all the pieces that Bach ever wrote, and then churn out music that was quote unquote like Bach. And so I was asked to do an NPR program on some of the pieces that this actual AI generated music had created and compare them to Bach. And the thing that's interesting is, and again, it's so about listening, on the surface, if you don't really know this music well, it sort of sounds like it is like what a Bach piece would write, but what it's completely missing is all the surprises. In other words, what AI does is it tells you predictions. Yet what's really interesting about music is when it doesn't give us what we expect. When you read a mystery novel, what you want is, if you can figure it out in page 5, it's not interesting. What's really interesting is the surprises. Eine kleine Nachtmusik. You start with a single note. Then you add a lower note. Then you put 3 of them together. Now, if I play this, that's what AI might give us. It's a note, it's a pattern. I'll now give you 3 patterns. AI discovers that you have an idea, you embellish the idea, and you decorate the idea. But this, it's the third one that's boring. You have 1, more information, 2. When I do 2 of them, it's a pattern. The third one insults me. Mozart, no AI gives you. That's what's missing. And that's the whole reason why we bother to do music, because it doesn't give us the world we know. It gives us the one we can imagine. So that's what's missing in all of it. It's the surprise. Patterns are not what are interesting. Patterns are only there to be broken. AI tells us what we already know, but it doesn't tell us what we don't know.
Well, that's an interesting one. Thought of it like that. Now, you mentioned about business people and boards and so on. And since I met you, and it really reinforced my belief system on that. Every board that I speak to, I say, please start hiring musicians, conductors, anthropologists, psychologists, and really go to the people actually who listen, who can feel, and be an integral part of that. Not many have picked up my advice to date. Why is there such resistance? Because if you have a board of, say, 10, 12 people, and there's a musician there who listens differently, or a conductor who literally looks at the orchestra, which is the board itself there, and comes up with different outcomes. Why is that such an issue in the world today?
Well, I think,
security, is it ego?
One of the things I was very struck by early on, when I was in my 20s, I taught for 6 years at Yale. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was what I thought would happen, and what was exciting about being a faculty member at Yale University when I was 25 years old was I thought, wow, here is this incredible diversity of opinion. I'm going to become a fellow at one of these colleges, and I'm going to hear these wide-ranging conversations all over the map. I'll be with the physicists and I'll be with the English professors. But in fact, almost everyone got there by becoming an expert at a smaller and smaller body of knowledge. And then after a while, you become invested in this smaller and smaller body of knowledge. And I found that, I started to feel like I was really smart, but really all I was smarter about this tiny bit of knowledge and smarter than a bunch of, recent high school graduates. But you become very invested in your branch of medieval literature or your knowledge of, whatever your particular field of expertise is. And you start to really identify with that. And you start to feel, and there was tremendous friction and battles between the different divisions as each group wanted to protect their turf. Even within music, the composers didn't want to talk to the musicologists, they were idiots. They were just interested in history. Everyone was protecting their little area of turf. And then the more you get invested in that area of turf, you get invested in the idea that no one can possibly understand you unless they have that similar basis of knowledge, which is why you have these journals which people submit articles to, which are read by the only 10 people who actually understand what it is. So I feel like there's a tremendous fear that if you let these musicians on the board or people outside that area of expertise that you have, that your area of expertise will be devalued. Plus, I think there's a lurking fear that perhaps I should know about this stuff, but what will be exposed is that actually all I know is my one narrow area of expertise. And if a musician could tell me something about it, it literally undercuts my reason for being that expert in the first place. And what it also does, and again, it's another failure of listening, what it doesn't acknowledge is that almost everyone in whatever company you're dealing with is actually creating a product, not for experts. I mean, who of us has ever really figured out what Microsoft Word can really do? I mean, I know there's some engineer who thinks, on page 3000 of the manual, there's some feature that really is fantastic, but it's actually being designed for real people. Every product that a company has created or a service is designed for real people. So who would have a better sense of what's valuable in that product than the whole range of humanity? So I do think it has to do with fear that we ourselves are not broad enough, that our own expertise will be undercut. What could they possibly know? But again, it comes down to a kind of listening and a willingness to be able to listen to all kinds of diverse opinions. But I'm not surprised that you have trouble.
Yes, I've recommended these kinds of people to everybody now, and I've actually created a youth board of 10 young people below the age of 25, all of them, to advise older people who are sort of 60 plus, and basically they are now bridging those two sides, and I think that's really, really important.
Well, I think, also, I mean, it's amazing. Now, you probably won't believe this from being outside the music world, but I can't tell you how long it took to actually get a musician on the board of orchestras. For a long time, orchestra boards never included musicians. I mean, what could be more bizarre than that? I mean, that's a recent innovation, and still many boards don't have that. But most boards of music organizations do not have musicians on the board. We're not even talking about the general public. But I mean, it's not surprising. How could you possibly understand this unless you were an insider? But it's very challenging and interesting. People are afraid.
Yes, I mean, I introduced a very, very smart young lady to a board, and she was a scientist. She was a microbiologist professor. And one of the board members said, yeah, she's really charming, but should we really include her on the board because she's a scientist? And we're not. And I'm like, I said, are you hearing yourself speak right now? She's a scientist. What do scientists do? They look at hypotheses, they experiment, they ask different questions. And he said, perhaps you're right. So they actually did, in fairness, take her on board. But the initial response was, we can't have her in this technology-based company because she's a scientist in a different, completely different space. So yes, but people are actually now listening a little bit more because what used to be, I used to be very novel 5, 6, 7 years ago. As a futurist myself, it's quite funny. 7 years ago, I was 7 years ahead. 5 years ago, I was 5 years ahead. A year ago, I was just about there. Now, the future has already happened. It's just unevenly distributed. And therefore, I'm just connecting the dots, providing context, providing wisdom, as opposed to really, really going out and sharing the future. So this is one of the reasons I started creating this platform, of actually sitting and talking about what is the voice that we'd like to hear, what is the voice we'd like to project, and connecting technology, humanity, science, society, and that fusion of pulling it all together. Just for our listeners and viewers, Rob, you worked with people with the Senate, for example. What are the US Senate? Could you share some of the stories about them? And what did you learn? What do we
Well, this could not be more topical. I mean, if you're talking about the failure of listening, I mean, can you just look at last week's battle for who was going to be Speaker of the, I mean, the yes. Speaker of the House, I mean, 15 rounds of voting to decide. I mean, the complete lack of listening has it is the definition. I mean, if you are looking for one metaphor for the lack of listening, it's the US government. I mean, no one is hearing anyone. I mean, no matter it doesn't matter which side you're on. I mean, first of all, just the definition that almost everything has become a simple party line vote.
Yes.
Which means no one is hearing anyone. I mean, do really all 100 and so Democrats think the same? Or 100? I mean, the notion that we would all vote as a bloc is by definition the lack of listening. The idea that an individual could make an individual choice, actually listen to the situation at hand, is completely vanished. The entire system is based on complete lack of listening. It's almost hopeless. By the way, that's one of the wonderful things about music. At least it can, if it's instrumental, once there's words, you're already in trouble. But at least if it's instrumental, it can appeal to both sides, and it can actually open up, a little space for true listening. But I would say that the US government is the complete metaphor for people stopped listening years ago. And the only thing that you can be sure of than the fact that no legislation will be passed is that no one will listen to anyone else.
I think this is for another time in another place, that I have a lot of views in terms of how media is impacting that, how social media is polarizing us, how our brains are being hacked by definition, in terms of thinking in a certain way, in a certain direction. Those are some serious issues that we have to deal with and address. But that's, again, for future.
I mean, what is the most common algorithm is, if you like this, you'll like that.
Yeah.
All that produces is the lack of. What's really interesting is if you don't like this, that might be something that's really interesting. And it's all about funneling you this way instead of this way. And as I said from the beginning, for me, the metaphor for my career is you throw a pebble and the circles keep getting wider and wider. And that's what I've tried to do in the music I've done and what I've thought of as a career. I mean, there was no career for what I do in the beginning, but gradually, if you just open yourself to what could I possibly say to Tarek, or what could I possibly say to CEOs in Istanbul, there was nothing in my training that was about that. But if you're listening to the world, it gets wider and wider, and you try to feel, how can I connect to them? How do those worlds connect? Whereas what most people do is try to create the smallest possible world in which they're comfortable connecting, rather than, okay, here are the dairy farmers of America. What can I possibly say to the dairy farmers of America? Well, the hallmark greeting card creative writing step. When you do that and you go through the uncomfortableness of saying, do I connect with them? That's when you actually start to get wider. And that's when connection starts happening. And as that princess says, it's the person next to you.
You worked with some great business leaders, including people like Steve Jobs, who you suggested was a good listener. I'd like to understand what you mean by Steve Jobs being a good listener, because so the general belief, not my belief, the general belief system is that he just didn't listen to anyone. He did what the hell he wanted to do himself. But I'm sure he was.
No, actually, I never worked with Steve Jobs.
Okay, other business leaders, but I mean, stories like that.
I will say this. I did work with Michael Eisner when he was the CEO of Disney. And I still remember really going to an interesting meeting there. And what they were trying to do was create a different kind of vacation experience for people who had already done the Disney kind of experience. Was there a kind of an education kind of Disney experience that they could have? And the interesting thing that he said to me was that, good companies meet customer expectations. He said, but great companies exceed customer expectations. And that really, and so he said to me, what can you create? He said, again, and this is back to the AI and what's interesting about human versus AI. He said, people have an expectation of what a Disney experience would be, but what can we do that would exceed their expectation of what a Disney experience? Because we say the word Disney and we imagine what it could be, but having the courage to actually, exceed expectations. I think that's really interesting. And that's what I try to do for myself, exceed my own expectations.
Thank you for that. Now, getting towards the end of this wonderful, amazing conversation, Rob, I mean, you're just so engaging. I could spend the whole evening here with you. What is your synthesized message for us listening to this as we look into the future? What is that message that you wish to amplify, and we'd like to hear your voice towards that particular message.
Right. I think, again, I keep coming back to this. You know, it's funny, when I wrote my first book and I came up with the title, All You Have to Do Is Listen. At that point in my career, I had no idea the wisdom behind that title and how widely applicable All You Have to Do Is Listen would be. I mean, at that time, I just thought all you have to do is listen. That's how you get what's going on in a sonata. I had no idea, you know, the circles would get so wide with such a simple title. All you have to do is listen. But I do think that that's at the heart of it. You know, it's interesting. In that book, there was a chapter titled Forward, Backward Listening. And it was based on a quote from Heidegger, which is, life must be lived forwards, but understood backwards. And I think we have just lived through a really, well, it's still not over, but this pandemic period, we have lived through it in a forward direction, basically being forced in a way that we've never been forced in history to radically alter what we've done in the past. In other words, business as usual, at least in my lifetime, has never stopped so completely as it did then. And I think going forward, people did what they needed to do to survive, coming up with whatever they needed to do when they didn't have a job, when we could only communicate, when you can't do a concert. People did a whole bunch of things. And now we're in this looking backward phase of trying to understand what just happened. And not only what just happened, but what does what just happened mean for the future? And I find in my business, there's this interesting moment of people trying to decide, who are we now? Do we want to really snap back to what was before and essentially just have these years be an interregnum period that happened, and we'll look back on it and someday in a museum and they'll have a mask and we'll all remember what it was like? Or was there something that happened as we were living going forward that we didn't understand, but that maybe actually could change what the future will be? And I see us going in both directions. I'll just give you something that seems like a local example, but it's really a metaphor for the big picture. During the period of the real pandemic, where you could not do any concerts, all of a sudden, every orchestra, every musician's fundamental being doing concerts for live audience was eradicated. And many businesses had the same experience, but it was completely eradicated. We were forced to come up with all sorts of innovative solutions that we never would have come up with had there not been a pandemic. All of a sudden, everyone discovered Zoom. Everyone's house included microphones and cameras, and we learned about lighting and we learned about interfaces. All sorts of interesting things happened. I started teaching courses online. I did 3-part series on what Beethoven has to teach us on the art of listening in the pandemic, connection, all sorts of interesting projects, many with you, many with Istanbul as well, got created that would never have been created before. We all learned how to do virtual presentations. And what we discovered, at least in the music world, was suddenly there was a different audience. In other words, most music institutions are fundamentally local. The Boston Symphony plays for Boston. Now, occasionally they go on tour, but fundamentally the Boston Symphony's audience is Boston. But suddenly, once you put it out on the web and all you're doing is web concerts, you have the potential of a global audience. Suddenly, the Boston Symphony's audience could be anyone who has a computer. And if it's not streamed live, but it's archived, literally anyone, any place in the world, no matter what the time difference, can actually be the audience for the Boston Symphony. Now, this made a complete shift in how organizations started to treat their audience. Does this mean we market to a global audience? How does that change our marketing procedures? How does that change our ticketing procedure? Everything got completely changed. Now, as concerts are coming back, again, that was life lived forwards. Now we look back, well, what does that mean? Who should we be now? Should we integrate that knowledge? And should we be striving to become a global audience for the Boston Symphony? Now, that would change everything. Your marketing, your virtual, all your resources would have to change. And now people are trying to figure out, what did that mean for us? Do we forget about that and never do another virtual concert? Do we just go back to the model we had before, which is not working because habit and routines have changed? In other words, so much of subscription concerts was about people just getting used to each year buying their subscription to the symphony and going back year after year. But now once that's been vanished and people are used to sitting on their couch and watching on a screen, people are not coming back. Some are afraid of COVID, but the audience for music is declined vastly. So now orchestras are trying to decide, who are we? Do we integrate that new video technology and become global organizations? Do we snap back and ignore? And people are trying to figure out, who are we? And so they're asking the most authentic questions, or they're not. And you see the complete range. You see some people who are literally trying to just get back to as if the pandemic had never happened and do the business that they did before without listening and realizing that the audience has changed. You hear some who are trying to really integrate what they did in the pandemic, but that means a complete rethinking of scarce resources. And you see all over the map, this question out there is, who are we? How has this changed us? Also, during the pandemic, at least in music, there was the whole, particularly in America, there was the whole George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movement, which has completely changed orchestras' ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What repertoire should we now be doing? Orchestras are saying, should we be doing Black composers? Should we be doing women composers who are allowed? There's a wonderful opportunity for each organization to say, what have we learned? Was this a positive experience? How has it changed who we are? Or to ignore it. And that's what I find most interesting now, because I see the complete spectrum from groups completely wanting to ignore it and pretend that it never happened, to groups fundamentally rethinking, are we a global organization? Are we diverse? Do we have equity and inclusion? What is our repertoire? What is the canon? And we see the whole map, but we're still in the middle of it. So life is meant to be lived forwards, but understood backwards. We're now in that place where we're neither backwards nor forwards. We're still in the middle, but there's interesting questions, but only if you hear them.
So Rob, to end this wonderful conversation, can we go back to your passion as far as Beethoven is concerned, and also how we listen in life, and him as a metaphor and as an example of what listening is about? Perhaps you could share some thoughts on that.
Sure. Beethoven and connection. You know, it's interesting. People are often amazed that so much of Beethoven's music was written after he was deaf. And, you know, people think, well, how could he possibly write, music when he was deaf? Thinking that the real challenge was, how can you write music that you can't hear? Well, if you're a professional composer, that isn't actually that difficult. I mean, I'm sure all of you, if I just say, sing in your head, happy birthday, and try it, you can all hear that music in your head. Now, it's a little more sophisticated to do a symphony, but at that point, it wasn't the challenge of actually hearing the notes. It was really the isolation that his deafness produced that actually had the most impact on Beethoven. And he wrote music that was all about connection, but connection in a different kind of way than we normally think of it. So let's take the most famous example I know. Everyone knows these four notes. And so, first of all, how do we get an idea across? Everybody plays the same notes. If you've got a message, have your communications department communicate clearly. So let's look closely. What have we got there? We've got three of the same notes and then a leap down. So I'm going to call this 1, 2, 3, down. No, what do you do with an idea? This is what AI misses. Okay, we then do the same idea here, lower. 1, 2, 3, down. Now, this is an assumption about the audience. How many times do you have to repeat an idea before your audience is connected to it, before they understand the idea? So you've got it here, 1, 2, 3, down. Then you say, I'll do it lower. So the idea is 3 repeated notes, 1, 2, 3, down. Now here's what no computer could ever do. Then we suddenly take these 4 notes, but we put a chord underneath. This loud idea, which everybody plays together, now becomes a soft idea with just the first violins and a chord underneath. Suddenly we discover something about that idea that we had no idea before. Now, how do we connect to people? Who do we connect to? How similar to someone do we have to be to still be connected to them? God forbid they're Republicans and Democrats. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3 down. Now we start to do all sorts of different versions. 1, 2, 3 down, but it's always 3 repeated notes and then something down, even if the down is different, even if you're Asian, even if you're Jewish, but it's still 1, 2, 3 down. We're still all connected. 1, 2, 3 down, 1, 2, 3 down, all over the place, but we're all still connected by our fundamental essence. 1, 2, 3 down, 1, 2, 3 down, 1, 2, 3 down. Now watch closely. We gradually expand who we're connected to. Now instead of 1, 2, 3 down, we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We are gradually expanding who we're connected to, one by bit. Now it's not 4 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we're going in the opposite direction here. Suddenly we're even expanded to the people who are doing like us upside down, the Republicans and the Democrats on Medicare. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Now we've added one more note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we finish the thought by expanding who we're connected to even more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we've taken a simple 1, 2, 3, 4. We've made into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Even the professors of English and neurobiology are connected. Now we've got a new idea. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to skip ahead. We come to a second theme, a group of people that sound so unrelated on the surface that we would never believe we could be connected to them. Palestinians and Israelis. This music sounds completely unlike, and completely unlike, this sounds completely different. But if I clap the rhythm, if I get beneath the surface differences between you and I, what we look like, what we believe in, and I clap the rhythm, which is the most fundamental thing that connects human beings, and I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's the same as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now their shapes look completely different. One goes down and then up. One goes like completely different, but beneath the surface differences, we're all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but only if we listen past our surface differences. Connect, only connect. Beethoven's fundamental compositional technique says we look at things and we see difference, but what's fundamental is what's the same. And finding that fundamental connectedness and unity behind surface difference is now the principal work of a Beethoven composition.
What a wonderful way to end, Rob. It's been an absolute pleasure, delight, as always. And every time we talk, I learn so much more. And I was listening, what I call first principles listening, with an open mind and open heart and open, and just like a little kid. And I am like a little kid with you listening. And you have provided us so many messages for the future, Rob. Thank you very much indeed for this. And we'll certainly have you over in this part of the world. And a lot of the messages in this particular conversation will, I'm sure, inspire and resonate with a lot of people. Rob, you're an amazing man. Thank you very much. We're grateful. God bless. And hope to see you soon.
Pleasure was all mine. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much indeed. Super.